I think it's time we take a deep dive into the next Impel Down breakout, because as Egghead continues to come to a close, I know that a lot of us are getting excited for ELBAF, and it's easy to see why. Vegapunk said that ELBAF is where our log poses were pointing. It's been pretty much 1,000 chapters since we first heard that island ever existed, and there are even ELBAF figures being released in November. But I think the Straw Hats are gonna have to make a quick detour before we get there, which shouldn't be that surprising because Oda's done this a number of times before major arcs. When we thought we were going to Fishman Island, we instead got separated at Sabaody and then had Impel Down, Marineford, and then the 2-year time skip before we eventually got there. And then whenever we thought we were going to Wano, we regrouped at Zou, but instead found out we had to go to Whole Cake Island instead to go save Sanji. Oda loves to take detours and divert from the original plan. And no, I don't think we're going back to Impel Down ourselves, but I think we can act as the catalyst for the next breakout by instead going to Sphinx Island. This island is Whitebeard's birthplace and the home to both his and Ace's graves. This is a place that a lot of fans have wanted Luffy to see at some point before the story is over, including myself. And the reason why now makes perfect sense is because we know this island is nearby, and also likely only a very small detour on our way to ELBAF. We know this because Shanks dropped Marco off there on his way to ELBAF just recently after Wano ended. So it seems this island is between ELBAF and Wano, meaning that if there was ever a time for us to stop there, it almost has to be now since we're gonna pass it if we go to ELBAF right away. But the bigger reason that this all needs to happen is Weevil, Whitebeard's supposed biological child who even once held the title of Warlord, who we recently saw protecting Sphinx Island from the Marines who were after Whitebeard's treasure. I think it's time Oda starts connecting the dots with this guy, and the place to start that is with Vegapunk, because old Miss Buckingham Stussy told us he was the man who could prove to Marco that he's Whitebeard's child. Since the Straw Hats were tasked with getting Vegapunk off the island, it would then make a lot of sense that we would be the ones responsible for making this connection happen. Now, granted, Vegapunk is currently dead as of the time I'm recording this video, but between all the satellites, Punk records, and Oda's general unwillingness to kill off his characters permanently, there's at least a few ways Marco can get the proof that he's looking for. And that's really, really important, because Weevil was recently defeated by Green Bull and taken at Impel Down. If Marco can be reliably convinced that Weevil is Whitebeard's biological son, then he would likely feel it's his responsibility to try and help him, right? I mean, that's basically his brother at that point, which then gives us a great motive for Marco and maybe even the other Whitebeard pirates to initiate an Impel Down Breakout 2.0 type situation, which I think a lot of people have been theorizing would need to happen eventually. At a bare minimum, this would get Doflamingo and Bon Clay out into the action again, where they would then likely team up with the Cross Guild. And the reason this makes so much sense is because that crew is already made up primarily of ex-warlords, which Doflamingo is one. And we even have this panel from Roger's execution in Chapter 0, where we see 5 of the future warlords lined up. Since 3 of them have already teamed up in the Cross Guild, it kinda makes sense that the other 2 will as well. And maybe even Weevil, who is also a warlord, but we'll get into that in a minute. And then as for Bon Clay, well, the Cross Guild already has Mr. 0, Mr. 1, and Mr. 3, so adding Mr. 2 into the mix just makes a lot of sense. This kind of idea has fueled a lot of theories that Cross Guild would be the ones to do the next Impel Down breakout, but as you'll hopefully see over the course of this video, I think the Whitebeard pirates just make a lot more sense, even if most of the escapees end up joining the Cross Guild anyway. Because the true beauty in this whole idea is that it's almost a flawless parallel to the first Impel Down breakout, since we're yet again trying to save Whitebeard's son. The first time it was about Ace, but now it's about Weevil. First it was Roger's biological son, and now it's his greatest rival, Whitebeard's biological son. Or at least that's what we're being led to believe, and I'll get into how that might work a bit later in the video. And I think what's even better is that Marco would parallel Luffy perfectly here, because Luffy went to Impel Down to go save his brother, his adopted brother actually. And Marco would be doing the very same thing because him and Weevil would also be adopted brothers. And what's interesting is Weevil doesn't view them as family right now. Miss Buckingham said that they were all playing family, but Weevil is the only true son. If Marco went to go save Weevil, it would show that they are truly a family. family, that they are truly brothers, and that Weevil maybe needs to change his tune a little bit about how he talks about the other Whitebeard pirates. I mean, this dude took out 16 different Whitebeard captains already. He obviously doesn't understand what his dad was truly about, but Marco will teach him by going and saving him. This whole Impel Down thing could be one of the deepest and most emotional moments that we've had in quite a while. Weevil is not gonna know what to think after it's all said and done, and he'd probably make great use of the sponsor for today's video, BetterHelp. Because let's face it, there's a lot of things that could affect your mental well-being on a day-to-day basis, like losing loved ones or having relationship issues, or even something as simple as negative comments online. I mean, as a content creator, that's something that I've definitely dealt with before, and while most of you are nice, certainly, there is that odd negative comment here or there that kind of messes up your whole day. And one issue that I've run into before is I often try to bottle this up and move past it myself, instead of getting it out into the open and talking about it with somebody. And while it's nice to have a friend around who's willing to lend an ear, not everyone may have one, or you may have something more personal that you don't want to share with your inner circle. That's where having a licensed therapist around can be really helpful, and why I want to introduce the sponsor for today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that makes professional therapy more accessible, affordable, and convenient. So anyone who struggles with life's challenges can get help anytime, anywhere. And they have a network of more than 30,000 licensed therapists that provide therapy in a number of ways, like video chats, phone calls, and even messaging, whatever you are most comfortable with. And if you ever feel like your therapist isn't a great fit, you can easily switch to a new one at no additional cost. And mental health is something that I'm super passionate about, and something that I wish we could kind of normalize and make therapy for much more accessible. And that's why I really like BetterHelp, because whether you live out in the middle of nowhere or even in a big city, you can reach out and get the help that you need. And if you think therapy would be helpful for you, I encourage you to check out BetterHelp. And you can start by going to betterhelp.com/daxsake or select Daxsake at sign up to get a special discount on your first month of therapy. But thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. But before I continue talking about the Impel Down breakout itself, I think we should touch on how exactly we're going to get to Sphinx Island in the first place. Because as I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, our log pose is currently locked on to ELBAF, and probably Winter Island we can presume, because the log pose just has not updated since we got to Egghead. We just have not been here long enough for it to recalibrate. So in terms of getting to Sphinx, I think it's entirely possible that the log pose just updates before we get off the island. I mean, that was all the way back in chapter 1090 that we first learned about that, and it would be kind of a fun twist if we saw that we're going to a different location than we thought once we get out to sea. Or alternatively, since we know that Sphinx Island is between Wano and ELBAF somewhere, it might not be that far of a detour on our way to ELBAF, and we could just run into it naturally, or maybe Oda could introduce some shenanigans to blow us off course or something. One way or another, there's just a lot of different ways that Oda could get us to Sphinx Island if he wanted to. I mean, hell, whenever the Minister of the Left first explained how log poses work to Nami, he even said that the island's magnetic field can sometimes vanish entirely. I think Oda's got to bring this into play eventually, and you know, since Kid is the one who just lost at ELBAF, and he has the magnet fruit and he has awakened it before, maybe his redemption arc, if he has one, can almost start by him shutting off ELBAF's magnetic marker so that nobody else can find it. I mean, I'm sure the last thing he wants is for the Shanks crew to turn around and find him again, so unless they have a Viver card to the island, this might actually work as a way to deter new combatants from coming to the island. I mean, Oda's got to have some plan with this guy, right? And even outside of all that, I mean, we've already had 2 different islands in the post-time skip alone that we visited without using a log pose. The first one was Punk Hazard, which we visited because of a call for help, and then we also got to Zoe because we were using a Viver card. So case in point, Oda has a lot of different ways at his disposal to get us to Sphinx Island. And while this Weevil and Impel Down situation will of course be a major part of the supposed Sphinx Island arc, I think there's also a lot of other reasons why Oda would want to take us here. I mean, yes, we have to see Ace and Whitebeard's graves at some point, but there's also been so much going on around the world recently that I think our crew kind of needs to stop and regroup a little bit. I mean, Law and Kid have both lost since we last saw them. There was the whole Kobe and Garp situation, so we need to get Luffy's opinion on that. At some point, Luffy needs to hear about the man marked by flames, because it seemed like Kid, Law, and Blackbeard all knew about it, but Luffy had no clue, and for reasons I'll get into towards the end of the video, I think this is the perfect place for that. But it even seems there's a chance we end up taking the CP SCP-0 Stussy away from the island as well, because we recently saw her kind of debating her future after Edison told her to go. And if she does get on the Sunny, then this gives us yet another great reason to go to Sphinx Island, because then Stussy the clone can meet Stussy the OG. And not only would that be a fun interaction for us fans to see, where we could maybe learn more about that situation in Bakken's past, but it could also be a perfect segue to this whole Weevil situation, because we need to learn if he is truly Whitebeard's child. And I think the biggest clue about that whole situation is that Vegapunk is the one who can prove the truth. In fact, Miss Bakken was even said to be Mad's resident freeloader and a self-proclaimed scientist. With all of this kind of clone science surrounding this whole situation, I think there's little doubt that Weevil is going to be the result of some kind of science experiment. Now, with that being said, I doubt he's going to be a one-to-one clone of Whitebeard, kind of like Stussy is supposed to be of Miss Buckingham Stussy. But with that being said, since Miss Buckingham is so adamant that he's Whitebeard's son specifically, and that she could even prove the truth to Marco, I think Oda is setting up for something pretty big here, because we do know that Whitebeard and Miss Buckingham Stussy were a thing back in the day. I mean, in chapter 1096, she's draped all over him at God Valley, and Whitebeard's nurses even wore cheetah print, which Miss Buckingham still wears today. So my guess for this whole situation is that Weevil is pretty much a clone, but with 50% DNA from one party and 50% from another, which is almost what a child is, kind of, but just with extra steps, I guess. Like, he just wasn't made the old-fashioned way, I guess you could say. Weevil could basically be somewhat like the Seraphim, but instead of Warlord plus King DNA spliced together, it's like Miss Buckingham and Whitebeard DNA spliced together, which makes a lot of sense to me because we already know that this kind of combo clone technology exists, and this is why it's so key that Vegapunk is the one who can prove the truth here. He was probably directly involved in its creation, since we've already seen him have his hands over all sorts of clone creations before. And you know, since Weevil didn't bust onto the scene until the last 2 years, which is when the SSG really started taking off, it would make a lot of sense for this all to kind of merge together, especially because Weevil doesn't sound necessarily intelligent. He almost sounds childish, like he still has some growing up to do. And since the Seraphim were shown to be actual children, I wonder if Weevil kind of has the body of a man, but the mind of a child right now. Almost like Momo, but in a completely different way. Maybe this was because they didn't have the process perfected yet, like they seem to for the Seraphim now, or maybe Miss Buckingham even did this on purpose just so Weevil was easier to manipulate, which it does seem like she's doing, since she's basically using him to get Whitebeard's inheritance. Even in their introduction, we see her hitting him and he even says that it hurts, which kinda goes to show how strong Miss Buckingham could potentially be, I guess, but we even see her convincing him that he's the only son of Whitebeard and that the other Whitebeard pirates are just playing family, which is obviously capped to the highest degree. And her words are what's led Weevil to wipe out 16 different Whitebeard captains up to this point. But I don't think that Miss Buckingham made Weevil solely for selfish intentions. I think she did this because her and Whitebeard were truly lovers, but probably couldn't have a kid together. And no, it's not because he was 10 times her size, but I think this might go back to one of the oldest theories that I can remember since my first watch through of the series, which was that Whitebeard was unable to have biological kids, like he was infertile or sterile, which apparently aren't the same thing, but almost. And this would be why Oda decided to make this character's dream to be to find a family. If Chadbeard wanted to procreate, I'm sure he'd have some willing participants. At a minimum, Miss Buckingham Stussy, who, as I already mentioned, clearly had a thing with Whitebeard. It would make a lot of sense to me if he was just unable to have one on his own the way most people do, so instead, he became Oda's living embodiment of one of the most important messages in the series, found family. He went out and adopted a whole family of his own because it's just like he so eloquently said, no matter who your parents are, we are all children of the sea. And maybe this is something that the crew even knew about and why Marco is so skeptical of what Miss Buckingham is saying. And that would make it hit a lot harder later on when he finds out the truth, because Pops probably never thought he would get his own biological child just like this. Marco will understand the importance of this completely if he can be convinced of the truth. Like like Nekomamushi told him, it seems like Marco may have another memento of his dad's to protect, just as he's been doing at Sphinx Island. Marco, being Whitebeard's 1st Division commander, has taken it upon himself to live out his pop's will in a number of ways, even though, as he told Big Mom, all the Whitebeard remnants are free to do as they please. A dead man gives no orders. But saving Weevil, Whitebeard's true flesh and blood, potentially, would be too important to not at least give it a try, even if he needs to break into this supposedly impenetrable prison. And I think all of this would hit like 10 times harder if Marco gets down there and finds out Weevil now actually looks just like Whitebeard, which based off the last time we saw him, that would be kind of crazy. But remember, Weevil lost to Green Bull, and as we saw with Shinobu, when Green Bull gives you the old suck, you come out looking a bit thinner than before. I think there's an excellent shot this makes Weevil look like the spitting image of his dad. I mean, we already got this funny panel where Weevil looks at a picture of Whitebeard and asks his mom if he's looking into a mirror, and he seemed to be kind of serious about this comment. But imagine if he actually starts to look that way and everyone else is telling him the very same thing. Weevil would probably look at them and be like, what do you mean? I already looked like him, which would be pretty funny, but at least from Marco and the other Whitebeard pirates' perspective, this would all hit like a truck to them. Because while Vegapunk can provide one layer of proof for this whole thing, it would be a totally different ball game if they can all see that Weevil looks just like Whitebeard now as well. The proof would be right in front of them. We already know he has the strength of young Whitebeard, but to add the aesthetics on top would just be insane. But again, remember, Weevil doesn't like the Whitebeard pirates right now. He doesn't see them as Whitebeard's sons. But if Marco and the gang come down to save him in the name of their dad, that should at least prove to Weevil that these guys are his brothers, which would probably then plant some kind of seeds of doubt about what information his mom has been feeding him. This will probably move him to closer align to his own true will, which seems to also align with Whitebeard's and many of his other sons' wills, which is about beating Blackbeard. In Weevil's introduction, he said this is really what he wanted to do, but his mom steered him away from it, almost like Whitebeard tried to steer Ace away from it before Ace lost and got captured. It may be kind of a protective thing, but it could also be a selfish thing since she's keeping her eyes on that inheritance. The Whitebeard remnants already tried and failed to defeat Blackbeard in the Payback War, so when they go down to Impel Down to save Weevil, it may also be with the hope that Weevil pursues and achieves that revenge they all want so badly, even though we all know Luffy will obviously be the one to beat Blackbeard for good eventually, but there's still obviously a layer here where the Whitebeard pirates want some revenge. And it's hard for me to imagine a better end for these Whitebeard remnants than going down and dying while saving Whitebeard's son. Because that's kind of how Whitebeard died originally during Marineford. He went to go save Ace, but obviously they failed. So I think this time, at any cost, they're going to make sure that they succeed in their goal. And I think that's kind of smart from Oda, because these guys sort of need an endpoint somewhere. As we saw in Wano, Marco can still make a massive difference in any battle he decides to join in on, and a lot of the other Whitebeard pirates could probably do the same, especially now that the world and Impel Down are flooding. It would feel almost as weird to have them sitting idly by while the world goes through all of this, as it would be for them to come and continue helping us as much as we know they're able to do. Oda needs to figure out what he's going to do with these guys long term. So for their story to end while making sure Weevil's story continues would just be so emotional. They're basically making sure that what happened to Ace never happens again. But one other thing that I want to touch on real quick regarding the clone shenanigans from earlier is that if it's true that Weevil is kind of a combo clone or whatever you want to call it, then I think we should probably take a closer look at Big Mom. I mean, did she really have a kid the old-fashioned way with a tentata? She's 29 feet tall, for crying out loud. And did she really lit Pound? Well, I know on the surface it's easy to chalk this up to Oda being Oda, and that very well could be the case, but something that has always struck me as very odd is that Vegapunk and Big Mom's first child, Parosparrow, both have these absurdly long tongues. Parosparrow also has this really tall hat, which doesn't appear to have a giant brain in it, but the aesthetic is there. And the craziest part of all this to me for sure is that Parosparrow even recreated the Punk Hazard Lab out of candy because he had the blueprints. Like, this dude has to be some kind of genius, right? He's also one of, if not the most tactical of the Big Mom pirates, so generally speaking, he seems like a pretty smart guy. That's actually why he's my favorite Big Mom pirate, and I don't mean to throw any shade to Katakuri there, because he's also amazing, but I do mean to throw some shade to Carrot since he told her to eat grass. But the thing with Vegapunk is that he was a natural born genius. I know a lot of us think about his brain fruit in regards to his intelligence, but his fruit just lets him hold unlimited information, which is why his head is so big. But he was also smart before that. And now, to be clear, I'm not proposing Vegapunk is Perospero's dad, because the timelines don't match up very well, and you just have to imagine that information would come up at some point by now. But what about a Vegapunk relative? The smarts and the tongue are probably traits that can be passed on through lineage factor or whatever, so who knows? And we also know that Judge has worked with technology to create like bio-enhanced children or a clone army, which are kinda close to the things Vegapunk's been doing as well. So maybe Big Mom just worked with Mads back in the day to make this happen. And that could even tie to the recent events of Whole Cake, where she tried taking Germa's clone army for herself. But the twist with Weevil then, compared to this situation, is that he may have been born or created using the DNA of a man who was not meant to have children, making Weevil almost like a miracle child of sorts, thus giving Marco and the gang all the more reason to go and save him. And I think they'd have to go and save him pretty much immediately, because we already know the upper cells of Impel Down are having flooding issues. Even if there is no scheduled execution for Weevil like there was for Ace, this gives us somewhat of a natural timer for them to go save Weevil and even all the other inmates in Impel Down. We kinda saw this begin to unfold in chapter 11-14 when Magellan and Doflamingo were discussing the situation. And if the flood were to go in full effect, then I'd almost have to imagine that the government would leave most of those prisoners for dead. Because if the flood really starts happening, I'm sure the guards are all gonna hightail it out of there instead of worrying about these prisoners, right? So this builds not only a reason for Marco to get in there to save Weevil, but for all of the other prisoners to kind of work together to escape just like they did last time. They probably all know they're gonna be left for dead otherwise. And I can already see a perfect parallel happening to the crocodile situation down in level 6. Maybe Marco gets down there and meets Weevil, they have this kind of emotional moment, but then we hear a familiar laugh coming from behind them, this time from Doflamingo, where just like Crocodile, he'll probably offer to use his powers to help them escape in return for his freedom, which I think his fruit could be a huge help in that regard, especially if you count his awakening. And honestly, this whole flood thing's gonna give Oda a great excuse to get all of the prisoners out there and bring tons of familiar faces back into the story. Like maybe Senor Pink can escape and have that drink with Frankie, maybe Arlong can escape and even help people get out since he's a fishman and there may be some flooding and everything, and maybe we'll even get to see King and Queen again. I mean, we do need to see Queen again since he also lost a Green Bull and might look quite a bit different now, and he did tell us that if he got too skinny, he'd be too popular. There's just so much that Oda could do here that it arguably makes me even more excited than the first time we did this. But at the end of the day, the one who stands to benefit the most from this whole ordeal is the Cross Guild. I mentioned earlier why Doflamingo and Bon Clay will likely join this group, but I think there's a great shot for Weevil to do the same. Not only is he already an ex-warlord like the others, but if he did join, it would really start making the Cross Guild look a lot like the Rock's crew. Some people have already kind of noticed this already since the group has a lot of infighting and they don't seem like a typical pirate crew with all the strong personalities, but if you add Weevil into the mix to kind of fill the role of Whitebeard, then you're really talking, especially if Miss Buckingham tags along since she was actually on the Rock's crew back in the day. And recently, we learned that the Cross Guild's overarching agenda right now is to go get the One Piece, thanks to a masterful speech from none other than Buggy D. Clown. And there even seems to be some urgency in this goal because Buggy specifically wants to beat Shanks there, who is currently making his move. So that means that the Cross Guild's goal now should be getting poneglyphs, specifically by either going after the man marked by flames or the Straw Hat crew. And that's exactly what I expect will happen, and why I don't think they're going to go to Impel Down themselves, because we've already seen some of the other Yonko collecting these poneglyph rubbings. Shanks beat Kid and took his rubbings at ELBAF, and Blackbeard straight up waited at Sphinx Island for one of Kid, Law, or Luffy to pull up with their poneglyph rubbings. Everyone is scheming right now to get away to Laugh-Tale as soon as possible, and the Cross Guild needs to do the same thing. These are the Yonko wars right now, and going to Impel Down does not really get them that much closer to that goal. But as I mentioned, instead, I think the prisoners who escape will just join them after being freed. Because let's say the Cross Guild does go after the Straw Hats. I bet Doflamingo wants in on that so he can get revenge. I bet Bon Clay wants in on that so he can see his friends again. And I bet Weevil also wants in on that because he's either gonna want to meet the man that his brothers and dad protected during Marineford, or hurt him, because he kind of already said as much back in chapter 802. Although after he gets to hear what his brothers have to say in Impel Down, he may have a change of heart on the matter. And as for when this Cross Guild and Straw Hat altercation takes place, I think that's definitely gonna be at ELBAF, which makes stopping at Sphinx Island beforehand to initiate the Impel Down breakout an even smarter move, because then we can leave Sphinx Island and start the ELBAF arc on our own and go meet Saul and learn about Nika and the Atom Tree and whatnot, while Impel Down and everything else is going on in the background. And Cross Guild being involved in ELBAF is like a no-brainer to me because Mr. 3 and Baroque Works were already heavily involved in Little Garden, where we first met the Giants and heard of ELBAF. I mean, Mr. 3 straight up almost killed Dorian Brogy, so roping him and the rest of that gang into ELBAF just makes perfect sense to me. And in order to take the poneglyph rubbings from the Straw Hats, I think they're actually going to have a Davy back fight. The first and for me biggest reason for this is that the Cross Guild is already made up almost entirely of people we've already defeated, so Oda skipping around rehashing those fights by giving us a Davy back fight would just be kind of genius. But the one fight we definitely need out of the Cross Guild is Mihawk vs Zoro, but conveniently the Davy back fight does have a combat round in the final round, so then we could have Mihawk vs Zoro be for all the marbles. If Zoro loses, then the Straw Hats might even lose their flag. And if you like this idea about a Davy back fight in ELBAF, then definitely go check out this video from my guy Randy Troy, where he broke this whole thing down in much greater detail. But maybe the one small caveat here to make is that if the Cross Guild starts a Davy back fight to get the poneglyphs from Luffy, then what is the Cross Guild risking in exchange? I know when Luffy fought Foxy the first time, he was kind of tricked into it, and Foxy baited him into accepting by asking if he wasn't a man and whatnot, but now that Luffy knows what the Davy back fight really is and we're this close to the end game, if we're really risking all the poneglyph rubbings, the Cross Guild better have something we want in return as well. And I think the thing that makes the most sense here is the final poneglyph that Luffy is missing, the one from the man marked by flames, meaning whoever wins this duel will get to go to Laugh Tale. And this whole man marked by flames thing is something that I think could start to unravel in Sphinx Island as well, because in my opinion, Whitebeard almost has to have something to do with this whole man marked by flames situation, because the poneglyph that individual has is the one from Fishman Island, which Whitebeard controlled for most of the Great Pirate Era. If that poneglyph was taken by force, then they would have very likely felt the wrath of Whitebeard by now, or at a bare minimum, Jinbei or Neptune would have said something about the ordeal and probably be worried about it. So based off of that, I think it makes a lot more sense that Whitebeard just had it moved for safekeeping. He may have known he would die soon and thus couldn't keep protecting it. And then I think this might explain the inheritance that Miss Buckingham and Weevil are so obsessed with, because so far this inheritance has mainly seemed to revolve around money. I mean, even the Marines came to try and find it, but I think it would hit a lot harder if the inheritance was more important than that, like being the final road poneglyph. I could see Whitebeard maybe moving the poneglyph to Sphinx Island a long time ago, but then after he died, or maybe before Marineford started, he had the quote-unquote man marked by flames sail around with it so Sphinx wouldn't get attacked by insanely powerful pirates all the time. Because it's one thing when Whitebeard's still alive, because if you go attack Sphinx, you know you're gonna have to deal with him later, but without him there to protect it, it would kind of make sense for someone to take it and move it, right? By making it a moving target, it would then be a lot harder to find than sitting at Sphinx Island. But then the question is, who is this man marked by flames that Whitebeard entrusted with this poneglyph? Well, I did do a full video on this before where I go into much greater detail, but to sum it up, I think it's going to be Masked Deuce, Ace's right-hand man from the Spade Pirates, who also became one of Whitebeard's top doctors. And wouldn't you know it, the last place we saw Masked Deuce canonically was Sphinx Island, when he visited Ace and Whitebeard's graves. I think it would just be such a beautiful move from Oda to tie together the last time we saw Deuce with the next time we saw him by having him also appear at Sphinx Island, and maybe he can even explain what's been happening with that missing poneglyph. Maybe Luffy will be at Ace's grave kind of having an emotional moment, and Deuce shows up and is just like, hey, those two left something for you by the way, and then we learn where that poneglyph has been. But what I would like even more is if the Cross Guild somehow came and took that poneglyph from him, and maybe that's why Deuce even returns to Sphinx Island in the first place. If he was meant to protect that poneglyph and it got stolen, then surely he'd want to come back and tell Marco or whoever about it. Luffy would probably almost take that personal after he learns how close Deuce was to Ace. I mean, that's basically Ace's Zoro, and this would give us a great motive to go take on the Cross Guild ourselves to get that poneglyph back and thus create this massive Davy backfight. And I think this could maybe lead to a situation where if Weevil does join the Cross Guild, he's gonna think it's his responsibility to protect that poneglyph because it was once his dad's, right? If his dad entrusted the man marked by flames to protect it and the Cross Guild goes and takes it, I bet you Weevil's almost gonna assume that position and say like, okay, I need to make sure nobody else gets this because it was Pops' greatest treasure. But if you want to hear more about the potential future of the Cross Guild, then go check out this discussion video I just did with Randy Troy over on my second channel, where we took a deep dive into that very subject, and I promise you're not going to want to miss it. But until next time, later.